going to try to tell you a little bit about my life. I will have to say that I was born of goodly parents, like Nephi. I loved my parents very, very much. They were Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins. They had 10 children: Nathan, Elvin, Laurena, Beth, and I was the 5th one, Hannah, Mary Laurena, and I'll have to tell you when she was 11 months old, she died of pneumonia. Bertha, Clyde, and Loretta. My dad had a farm, and he didn't raise very much on that farm. He had just a meager living. Of course, we never ever went without. We had plenty to eat and plenty to wear, but it wasn't like a lot of people could have. We weren't extravagant or anything like that. And we helped him on the farm as much as we could. He raised beets and potatoes and tomatoes and different things like this, and we would eat a lot of this. We'd have this for our food. Instead of going to the store and buying a lot of this food, then we would raise it, most of it. We were very happy. When Mary Laurena was 11 months old, she had pneumonia, very, very bad, and she died. But I remember I wasn't very old at the time, and so I went in one morning quite early, and I remember my mother had just got me a little rocking chair, and I said to her, "Mother, can I hold Mary Laurena?" And she said yes. I remember having a long dress on. And so I held her and rocked her and rocked her and looked into her little eyes. She was very, very sick. And pretty soon Mother came and took her and laid her on the bed. And in a few minutes she was dead. We had to work real hard in those days doing everything. We just had these old coal stoves. And we had to carry the water when we washed and put it in a tub and heat it, put soap in it and heat it up to do the washing. And then we had an old hand washer that we'd have to turn by hand to do the washing. And you can imagine how much washing we had to do with 10 in the family. But we got along. We appreciated what we had in those days. The people nowadays, some I don't think appreciate what they have. They want everything. But that's all we knew, and we didn't care. We loved to do these things. It took us a little longer in those days than it does now. It took us all day long to do the washing with that many in the family. But we were singing about our work and happy and contented as we could be. In those days, we didn't have cars. We had what they called buggies, white top buggies. They were quite large and had canvas on the sides, and in the summertime we'd roll these canvases up, and in the wintertime we'd roll them down to keep the cold out. They were drawn by horses, and my mother had a special buggy of her own, and she had a horse, and its name was Dawn, and this is the way she would go different places, was in this little buggy. And we also had a horse named Queen, and when my mother went out, almost every time my mother went outside, this horse would nudge her, just gently nudge her to the granary. He knew that the grain was in there. Then my mother would get out and get him some grain, and then he was satisfied. My dad tells this story about my mother. When she was younger, she was coming home from someplace in her little buggy, and this man drove up beside of her and said, "Mrs. Jenkins, will you race me?" And she said, "Sure." So she made the horse go real fast and raced him, and she won the race. And I can just hear my dad saying it now. He laughed and said, "And she won, too." My dad loved horses very much. He had quite a few, and he also had 2 pair of mules, a gray pair and a brown pair. And the next morning he decided to go to the neighboring town on business, but the night before he noticed that one of these gray mules was sick, and so he decided to go for help for it too. So he harnessed one gray mule and one brown mule together, and he was gone all day long, and in the meantime this mule just laid there all day long and never moved. Toward evening, when he was coming home, we heard the wagon coming, and we looked out and we saw this mule try to get up, and he finally struggled and got to his feet, and my dad stopped the other team in the lane, and we watched this other mule, and he just staggered toward the gray mule, and as he got to this gray mule, he put his face to this gray mule's face, and then he fell over dead. In those days, people would build cisterns and fill them with water. It was a big cement place, and it had a little roof on the top, right just above the ground. And one morning, when my dad came in from milking, he said, "Come and look." And so we went out and looked, and one of our horses had got on the top of that cistern and fell down. And oh, he was looking so forlorn and wondering how he was going to get out of there, I guess. And so my dad got the hay derrick and got him out. We lived close by a big canal, and people from all over, Magnan and places around, came up there to swim. We all had lots of fun swimming in there. One day we were swimming, and we heard the dog barking and barking, and so we got out to see what was the matter. And Porcupine was fighting with our dog, and it just got porcupine quills all over its face and around it. And so we got out and took it down to my brother, and he pulled the porcupine quills out. One day when I was little, I didn't know what to do. So we had a lot of big, tall poplar trees growing around our yard, and I looked up in one of those trees and saw a bird nest. And I thought, gee, I wonder if there's any eggs up there. That'd give me something to do. So I climbed up that tree as far as I could, and then I reached my hand up in the nest, and there was eggs. But there was also a snake, and it crawled down my arm and scared me so bad that I fell from where I was, and that was quite a ways. And it knocked me out a little while. When I woke up, then the snake was gone. I guess he was as scared as I was. When Grandpa was about 16 years old, they had a little pony, and when he was right little, he tried to jump out the window. They put him in the barn, and he tried to jump out the window, and he hit his back on the window and made this big hump on his back, and all his life he was called Humpy. And Grandpa's mother got very, very sick, and his dad was up in the field, and so he got on old Humpy. He was the only horse there that he could get on. So he got on old Humpy and went as fast as he could up to the field to get his dad. And when he got to the top of the hill, his dad saw him, and he unharnessed the horse from the plow and jumped on it and came down the hill as fast as he could. And when he got down there, he ran into the bedroom where his wife was very, very sick, and he picked her up in his arms, and she died in his arms. When I was in 8th grade, I was so tired of school, and I just wouldn't do anything. I'd just sit there all day and not do hardly any of my lessons, and so the teacher wrote a note home to my mother and said, you might as well keep her home. She won't do anything here. But I'll have to tell you about my brother Clyde. Oh, he was a terror. My mother would make him go on the school wagon every morning, but he'd beat the school wagon back again. And the teacher wrote a note also to her, and she said, you might just as well keep Clyde home. She said, we have a little fight every day. I'm trying to keep him here. He kicks my shins, and she said, and that's not too good, so you might as well keep him home. When we were kids, my dad made a big swing for us, and we used to have so much fun in it. One day I got in there and was swinging real, real high, and the rope broke. And oh, it just dragged me for a little ways and scratched me all up. And another time we were coming from school, and we had jumping ropes. We'd been jumping the ropes and having a lot of fun coming home from school. And a bus stopped. We thought, well, gee, we're going to get on the side of that bus. So we stepped on the step of the bus, and it started. And as I tried to get off, my rope caught on the thing of the bus and dragged me for a little ways. It's funny I'm alive, isn't it, from all them kind of experiences. Quite a few years ago, Grandpa and I went up in the field and back pasture, and we took our shoes and stockings off and waded across the canal, and then we found some prickly pears, and I wanted to bring some of those down to plant. And I didn't have anything to put them in, and so I had a little apron on, and I put a lot of them in my apron. When I got home, I just couldn't get the little things out of the apron, so I had to burn the apron. But I planted those little prickly pears, and they were so pretty. They grew for years. One day when we were coming home on the school wagon, we stopped in front of a little boy's place about a half a mile from where I lived, and he was getting out of the bus, and the school wagon, and he didn't see a car coming, and the car ran into him and killed him right there. And that was a very bad experience for us kids that was on the bus. One night, several of us girls was going to Mutual. Before we left, it was thundering and lightning. It was quite a bad storm, but we went anyway. And when we came out of Mutual, it was still very bad storm. And as we started out from the church house, lightning struck me and knocked me down. And I don't know how long I was there, but I got up and I felt all right, so we come on home. When we were growing up, I told you that we didn't have much money, and so my dad used to go to these Army surplus stores and get some of the clothes and shoes and things that we needed there. They weren't very expensive there. So one day he brought me a home pair of shoes, and they looked like boys' shoes to me, and I didn't hardly want to wear them, but I had to wear them to school. That's all I had. And so at recess I was getting a drink, and I turned around, and there was a girl standing with 3 other girls, and she was the only girl in the family, and she had long, beautiful red curls, and she just dressed so pretty. And I heard her say, look at her shoes. And then the others looked at him and started to laugh. And oh, I just felt so bad. I started crying and ran away to the schoolhouse. My dad raised a lot of horses, and he had this one little pony, a black and white pony, and its name was Sport. And he was riding it up in the hills one day, and as he went under a tree, a limb hit him and knocked him off the horse, and he just laid there to see what the horse would do. And the horse stopped right there and came over to him and just looked at him for a few minutes, and then he went over and just kind of nudged him a little bit, and then when Dad got up, then everything was all right. He just wanted to see if he was hurt. And then this same pony, Leroy tried to get on this pony one night, and he couldn't get on him. The horse wouldn't let him get on very much, and so he said, "I wish this horse was dead." So the next morning, Grandpa came in and he said, "Leroy, remember last night when you wished this horse was dead?" And he said, "Come here." So they went out there, and there had electric wire had fell down to the barn, and there was some water there. And this horse was laying across this wire in the water, dead. And oh, the kids felt so bad they didn't want to go to school. Every one of them just thought the world of that little pony. The first little car that I ever saw was when my mother was ready to have her last baby, and the doctor came in this little car, and it was in the spring of the year, and it was real muddy. And so he stopped just a little ways from the house and got stuck, and he couldn't make the car go any farther, so he hurried and put his boots on and run in to take care of my mother. That was the first time I ever saw a car. I'll have to tell you experience we had with our grandmother Jenkins. She was real sick, and she lived just a little ways from us, and Dad was out to see me at that time, and we went up there to see her, and they thought that she was going to die, and she did. And one of her daughters just started to cry and make a terrible fuss, and so she came back to life again. They had already taken her teeth out, and so they had to dedicate her to the Lord before she'd die again. I had an Uncle Hirsch that lived just a little ways from where we lived, and he had a big black mustache, one that's long on the side, you know, and you can just bring it around his finger. And every time my mother would churn, he would come over and get some nice, fresh buttermilk. And, oh, this big mustache would get down the glass, and he'd lick it off with his tongue. And I got so I just hated to see him come over. I never knew my grandmother Davis very well. My mother died, or she died when my mother was 3 years old. And so I didn't know very much about her. When we lived in Hunter, Fern was just a little girl, and we had one cow, and Fern just loved milk. We went away one day, and when we came back, this cow had got on a lucerne and bloated. And some men come over to try to help Dad to see if he could save her, but he couldn't. And she fell over dead, and Fern was standing in the door with me, and she started crying and said, "Now I can't have any more milk." And another time, she done something that Dad didn't like, and he said, "Oh, you don't like me anymore. I'm going over and sleep with the cow." And he had to cross some plowed ground, and so he went over and laid down by this cow, and she stood there for a few minutes, and then she trudged across this plowed ground, and she'd sink in and put in her every step, and she went over and laid down by Grandpa and the cow. There was 3 of them laying there. One day when we went to the field, Elaine was about 2 or 3 years old, and we went up there and Dad was plowing, and at noon he let the horses go in the field to eat until he needed them again. And so when he went down the hill to find them, he couldn't find them. And we could see him down in the trees. Dad was clear on the other side of where we were looking in the trees for him. And so I said to Elaine, "I'll have to run down and tell Dad, because he can't see him." And she didn't want to go. She wanted me to go. And I said, "Well, you'll be all right here for a few minutes, won't you?" And so as I was going down the hill, I could hear her cry, and she just cried till I come back. And so when he brought the horses up, she looked at him with little tear-stained eyes, and she said, "Daddy, your horses is down there in the tees." I met your dad, and I was engaged when I met him, but I talked to him a few times, and it was on a Saturday night, and Fred and I intended to go on a picnic the next day. It was Easter Sunday. So I had just got me a new hat, and I intended to wear that. And he was teasing. He was quite a tease. And so he took my hat and took it up to Bacchus. And I didn't know what to do, because I planned on wearing it the next day. So I sent my brother Clyde up to get it, and he wouldn't give it to him. So real early that next morning, he came and brought it to me. But I was engaged to a young man named Frederick Brown. And your dad wanted me to go with him, and I said, "No, I can't. I'm engaged, and we're going to be married pretty soon." So we got married on the 24th of June, 1924. Fred and I did. And the next day, he was transferred to Minnesota. So the day after we were married, we went clear to Minnesota. And he worked at the Mesaba iron mine in Minnesota. And when we first got there, we had to stay in the boarding house until we could get a house to live in. And when we got out of the car, a lady came up and took my hat off and said, "I heard that Mormons had horns. Where's yours?" And I said, "Oh, I left mine home." But anyway, he started to work. And one morning, bright and early, he went to work. And I got out of bed and then I went back in bed again, and pretty quick I heard a knock on the door. And I went to the door, and the man was there, and he said, "Your husband has been hurt real bad." And he knew at the time that he was dead, but he kind of tried to break it to me easy, I guess. So the next thing I knew, I was in bed. I fainted, and they put me in bed. And then he had just gone to work, and it was down in a mine where he worked, and they had a big crane of iron just ready to dump. And they always used to have a guard there. And this morning he didn't have a guard, and so he thought it was all right to go on through. So just as he got on through, just through the door, this crane load of iron fell on him and killed him instantly. And so when they came to tell me, of course it was a real shock to me, and it was on the 2nd of February when he was killed. So then we'd only been married for 8 months, and the next May, Dell was born. But they sent a registered nurse with me from there, because they was afraid to let me go alone. And so then I stayed with my mother and dad, and Dell was born there. I was a bride, a wife, and a mother inside of a year. He lived with Valate in Bacchus, and so after Fred was killed and I come home, then Valate told me that after we were married and gone, he said, "Well, I'm still going to have her for my wife. I know that I am." So it was quite a while. It was about a year after we started going together, and then in 1927, we got married in the Salt Lake Temple for time. And he said, when we came through the veil, all dressed in white, he said, "You just look like an angel." And he said, "I knew that you were supposed to be my wife all along." I'll have to make one correction. When I was telling you about Fred and I getting married, I said we were married in 1924. Well, it was 1923. After Dad and I got married, we lived up in Bacchus for a while. He worked at the Bacchus making powder, black powder. And we lived up there for a little while, and then we moved to Hunter and built us a beautiful home there in Hunter. And the Depression came, and of course we lost our home, and then we had to come back up here. We had 40 acres of land up here, and that's the only thing we could make a living on at that time, and so we came back up here. But one day when we were living in Bacchus, we heard a great big blast, and the black powder house, one of them, blew up. And Dad was in that, or he just had left it. And so I was so scared, I jumped in the car and went up to see what was happening. But I thought maybe he was in that, but he wasn't. And then after a while, maybe it was about a year after that, they had another explosion up there. And my cousin, Willard, was working up there, and he was in this explosion. There was 3 men that was killed in this explosion. His mother was going teaching at the time, and when she heard this blast, she said, "I know that Willard's in that." And so it just blew their bodies all over the whole field. And they just picked up parts of them and put them in little caskets, what they could find, and buried the parts that they could find. And soon after that, Willard's dad's house burnt down. And they fixed the chicken coop up and was living in the chicken coop. And a little while after that, Annetta, that's Willard's sister, she was in an accident right down across from our house. And they threw her in the ditch, and she almost drowned, but she was unconscious, and they brought her into our house. And I remember they got quart bottles of hot water and put all around her. Then they waited for the doctor and took her over to the hospital. She was in a coma for about 2 or 3 days, and then she died. After we lost our home and came up here, then we didn't have anything, and so the Relief Society helped us for a little while. Then they were building this road out here, graveling it in front of our place. And so he got on there for a little while, and then after that he got on the milk job. At first he just had a little sleigh, and I think it was about 5 cans, and 1 horse pulled it, and he had to go clear up to Sharon every day, and I think he just made about $5 a day. And then after a while he bought him a truck and had this steady job for a long, long time. He had quite a lot of experiences while he was hauling this milk. In the winter time he'd shovel and shovel and shovel snow. And I remember Worthy Beck said, you know, I went out there once and he was shoveling snow, and he said he was even singing. He said, boy, if it had been me, I would have been singing. And anyway, he had to go in the winter and summer too, and finally he got a lot of cans and had a pretty good job and made pretty good wages. Lots of times when he went out there, he would take him all day long to go to the creamery, when it was in the winter especially. And sometimes they would, some of them would change horses, give him fresh horses and put his horses in the barn to eat until he'd come back that far, and then he'd take his team and come on home. He hauled the milk for 28 years, and I don't know how he lifted all those great big cans. He wasn't a very big man. Dell was our oldest boy. He was Fred's boy, and when he was little, he weighed 24 pounds when he was 4 months old. And I remember going to Salt Lake once, and I was on the elevator, and I was carrying Dell, and there was 2 ladies came on the elevator, and they said, "Oh, look at that little lady carrying that great big baby. He ought to be carrying her." So after that, I got a cart to put him in. When he was 16 years old, they had planted peas, trying to plant peas around here on a part of a farm, and to see if they would grow. And so Dell and Don Hymas, that's his cousin, decided to go and pick these peas. So in the morning, I can just see him now. He was going in the car, and he had a straw hat on, and he waved and said, "Bye, Mom." And I said, "Goodbye, be careful." And so after he'd gone, then we went up in the huckleberries. And Russell Hymas, he was Dad's brother, and he went with us. And so we were up there in the huckleberries, and about 2 o'clock I said to Russell, "What time is it?" And he said, "It's exactly 2 o'clock. And I had kind of a little funny feeling, but it didn't seem like anything was wrong. And so we came home about 5:30 or 6 around there, and they had been hunting us and all over in the huckleberries, wherever they thought we would be, and trying to find us. Dale had been in a wreck, and it hurt him real, real bad, and he was over at the hospital, and they finally caught up with us and told us, and we went right over, but he died about 5 minutes before we got there. Dale just loved airplanes. At Christmas time, he would buy each one of the kids an airplane, and then he would play with it all day long. We used to buy him airplane kits, and he would make his own. He made quite a big one once and got up on the barn and let it go, and it went quite a ways. I remember when we'd be out and the airplane would be flying by, he would say, "Mom, this is a certain kind of airplane," and he would name the number that it was on, and that's what it was. One summer before Dad and I was married, there was a man that had a little airplane, and he came to Magnet and was taking people for rides up in this airplane. So Dad and I went up. We thought maybe Dell was too little to take up, it would frighten him. So when we came down, he cried and wanted to go on this airplane so bad, and I sure wish we had taken him. We lived in Bacchus when Fern was born. In them days, we didn't go to the hospital. They were born at our home. The doctor came to the homes. And they were born then, so she was born down at my mother's place. And my mother and Dad was there when she was born. And the doctor handed her to Dad, and he fainted. I guess he had never held a little one before, and kind of scared him a little or something, I don't know. And then Bruce was born in Hunter. We had moved down to Hunter then. Bruce was born in Hunter. And then that's when we lost our home. So the 3 of them, Fern and Dell and Bruce, was the only ones there. And we had to come up here then to work our farm because we didn't have any other place to go. And the rest of them was born up here in Idaho. Elaine was always small, and she still is. But when she graduated from high school, we went over and got her a pretty suit to graduate in. And one of the ladies said, "Are you graduating from grade school?" And she said, "No, high school." Everybody thought she was younger than she was. She looked like it. We had a horse named Snap, and Elaine used to like to ride him quite a lot. And she got on him one day, and with her girlfriend was on another horse, and they were going for a ride, and they went across a ditch. And old Snap didn't want to go across, so he threw her off in the water and made a big scratch on her face, kind of a gash, and she has a scar there still yet. Poor Jay, it seemed like everything happened to him. We had home teachers one night, and when we got through, opened the door and was letting them out, I heard somebody moan and groan. I said, "What in the world is that?" So we went out, and there he fell from a tree and broke 3 ribs. And then another time, him and Leroy wanted to go up in the hills, and he had a bad leg before he went, and I said, "You better not go," and it was awful cold at that time too, but they went anyway. So when they got home, his leg was just swollen real bad and all black and blue. And it really scared us, and so we took him right over to the doctor, and the doctor said he had gangrene in his leg. And he said, I want you to stay up all night long and change hot towels and put on his leg. So I did, all night long. I stayed up and put these hot towels on his leg, and it got better. When Dell was a little boy, he also had eczema on the back of his legs, and he used to dig and dig them until they bled. And we went to quite a few doctors and couldn't find a cure for him. Finally, we went to a little doctor over here in Montpelier, and his name was Dr. King, and he gave us some pink salve, and we put this on, and it cured it pretty good. But he was allergic to a few things, to eggs and acid stuff like tomatoes, and when he'd eat too many of them, then, of course, that would come back again. But he was a lot better. And then, when he was born, he had yellow jaundice, and real bad. He just about the color of orange, and the doctor was real worried about him. He stayed here all night taking care of him. But when he got over that yellow jaundice, he just grew and got so cute and so fat. And we took him to Salt Lake once. We got him a little ball cap style hat and a little suit. And we were in a store down there, and he was walking along, and people would come up and say, that's the cutest little fat guy I ever saw. One day, Bruce and Jay went up to the field to haul hay, and they had been gone quite a while, and we was getting kind of worried. And pretty quick, here came the team down running. They was running away, and they came home without the boys, and it scared us. So we jumped in the car and went up to find them, and right on top of the hill to the cemetery, there was a pile of hay, but we couldn't see any boys. And so we called and looked in that hay, thought maybe they was covered in the hay, but they weren't. And pretty quick we started going up farther, and here they came down, and just singing to the top of their voices, and they were all right, and we were so happy they were all right. Bruce and his family lived in Georgia, and one year on the 4th of July they came to see us, and we got the kids a lot of sparklers and things like that for the 4th of July. And they were playing out here on the lawn with their sparklers, having a lot of fun. And Bruce went up to change Dad off. Dad came down, he was mowing up there, and he came down to have his dinner. And so Bruce went up to change him off and mow up there. And so all of a sudden, while they were playing with these sparklers, Dad came out and he said, well, I'm going up now and changed Bruce off from mowing. And so Terry ran over to him and he said, Dad, can I go with you? And he said yes. So they got in the car and went up, and we had got a longer mower blade for the mower. And when he got up there, Dad stopped, and Terry got out and ran as fast as he could up to where Bruce was. And he hadn't remembered that this mower blade was a lot longer than it was, and so he stepped right in this mower blade, and Bruce happened to see him in time to stop, but it cut his foot right off. It was just hanging with a little bit of skin. And so they grabbed him and put him in the car and took him over to the hospital. And when he got over there, the doctor was just so worried. His shoe was just hanging off his foot with this little bit of skin. And Dad said, well, now, wait a minute, I want to get Bishop Tuller to come and give him a blessing. And the doctor said, we don't have time. He said, this boy should have been dead before now. And he said, well, wait just a minute. So he called Bishop Tuller, and Bishop Tuller did come and give him a blessing. And so when the doctor started to get into this, he got a lot of lucerne and mud and stuff out of it, and then it started bleeding. It bled quite bad, but they stopped the bleeding then. And when we went in, Bruce was sitting in a chair just right outside the door. They had Terry in the room on the bed, and he was just crying and sobbing. Oh, he just felt so bad. And so I went over to him and I said, put my arm around him, and I said, Bruce, don't feel too bad. I said, it was just one of them things. And he said, it was my fault. I'd done it. And we just couldn't stop him. He went out in the car and just sobbed and sobbed. Well, the doctors hurried and fixed his foot. It was 9 o'clock when they took him over. And he was in the hospital from 9 o'clock till 3 o'clock in the morning, and I stayed there with him. And about 6 o'clock that next morning, the doctor came, and he just stood in the door for a few minutes before he came over to look at his foot. And he had a sheet over his foot, and when the doctor lifted the sheet off his foot, he wiggled his toes. And I just know that it was a miracle. The nurse said when she picked up one of the tendons to match it with the other one on the other side, it just stood right up. And I know that it was a miracle, and it just strengthened my testimony. It just seemed like that should have happened. And he was in the hospital over here for about 3 weeks. And then we took him down to the Children's Hospital in Salt Lake, and he was in there for 6 months. He would write to us quite often. We'd go down every week to see him. Ivan hauled the milk, and so he couldn't go during the week, but every weekend we would go down in the hospital and see him. And so one day we got a letter and it said, or a card from him, and it said that they were going to graft skin on his heel. There was a little sore there about the big size of a 50-cent piece, and it wouldn't heal. And he said, Mother and Dad, can you come down? They're going to graft skin on my heel at a certain time. And so we were prepared to go down at that certain time, but it healed up and they didn't have to graft skin on it. We brought him home on Thanksgiving Day, and he done just fine. His foot was just a little bit shorter than the other one, but he hadn't had a bit of trouble with it. Once in a while it was a little tender and a little sore, but he just got along just wonderful with it, and I'm so grateful. Dell came home from school once, and he had traded one of the boys over there something for a pretty pearl-handled pistol, and he didn't know whether Dad wanted him to have it or not. And he said, "Do you think it'll be all right?" And I said, "I believe he will." And he said, "I don't know." So he went out in the pasture out here and hid it. I don't know where he hid it, and we've hunted and hunted for it, but we couldn't find it. And so I guess it's still out there someplace. He also had a cat, and he named it Paprika Prince. And every day when he'd go out to milk, he'd take this cat with him and sit it on the post, and the cat would open his mouth, and he would squirt milk in his mouth, and he just loved this cat very much. It was a beautiful cat. And he would even take it to bed with him. I didn't like him to take it to bed because I was afraid of cats in bed with kids. But I went in there one night, and I saw this Humpy in bed with him, but I just went out and left it there. Jay and Leroy both quit school, and I didn't like it very good, but I didn't know what I was going to do. So one day, Leroy's teacher called me and said, if Leroy wants to pass this grade, he's got to catch up on all his lessons. And he said, if you want to come over and get these books and help him, maybe we can pass him. So I went over and got books, and oh boy, there's about 5 or 6 or 7 great big thick books. And so I brought them home, and each night I'd say, now come on, Leroy, let's get these lessons. So he'd sit by me, and I'd read the lessons to him, and then I'd find the answer, and I'd say, now write this answer down. And he'd say, you write it down, you know it. And then he was asked a question once to name the 4 seasons of the year, and he did. It was fishing season, duck season, deer season, and one of the other seasons. I don't remember what it was. They had a little paper that they gave out each month to the kids in school when Jane was going to school. And in one of the papers there was an advertisement there, and it said a history book used very little for sale. And then J. Hymas' name was signed. On Christmas every year we used to take the kids over, and Santa Claus was over there and giving out candy to the kids. And one year we went over, and Leroy was sitting on Dad's shoulder, and so he gave him a sack of candy, and then he said, give my dad one too. And then another time Frank Brown was helping him put grain in the granary after they'd harvested, and he was they were both, Dad and both of them was working pretty fast, and Dad would go and take one in, and then he'd come back, and then Frank would go and take one in. So Leroy stood there for a little while. He was just a little boy, and he said, Dad, do you think Frank can handle that better than you can? And he said, oh, I guess so. And he said, no, he can't. When Jay was about 18 years old, he got a job on the railroad working out of Evanston. And he would go out there and stay all week in a railroad car with some other men. And so then he'd come home each week, and then the next week he'd go back again. So I'd take his clothes out and wash them every time he'd come. And so this one time I opened his suitcase, and it was full of bed bugs. And, oh, I didn't know what to do. If you once get bed bugs, it's hard to get rid of them. But I put coal oil all over them and burned his mattress, and they were just awful, but I finally got rid of them. We had 9 children. When our 7th was born, he only lived a few minutes and died. And the doctor wouldn't even let me see him. Dad and Leroy and the bishop took him up the cemetery and buried him. In 1848, we decided to go to the Logan Temple and be sealed together and have all the children sealed to us. Fern and Andy had just a civil marriage at that time, and they decided to go with us. So they went and were sealed together, and Andy stood in proxy for little Owen, and we give him the name of Owen. And I hope and pray that I live worthy enough to have a chance to raise him again when I go back there. Alan Hymas and Terry used to go fishing and hunting quite a bit, and so he came down here on one Sunday morning and asked Terry to go fishing with him. So Terry talked to him for a few minutes out there, and then he come in and said, Dad, Alan wants me to go fishing with him. Can I go? And Dad said, Terry, I'd rather you wouldn't go. And I know that your mother would rather you wouldn't go on Sunday, but you do what you want to do. So he went out, and in a few minutes he came back in and got ready for Sunday school and beat us down there. And we were so glad that he made the right choice. It makes you proud of them when they do that. When Elva was born, she was scheduled to be born in the hospital. She would have been the only one. The rest of them was born at home. But it didn't work out that way. I felt fine, and when I got up that morning, I stepped down on the floor, and I had a severe pain. And I got back in bed, and I had 3 pains, and she was born. And Fern, it scared all of us. Fern ran out the front door to go up on the hill to get Sister Austin. She was a midwife. And Dad would run out the other door, pulling his pants on. One pants leg was dangling. He went across the road to call the doctor, because we didn't have a phone at that time. So we had quite a deal here. I was scared to death. I just laid as still as a mouse. I didn't know what to do. Pretty quick the doctor and nurse and Sister Austin came and took care of me, and everything was all right. But I was sure scared. That's the first time anything like that happened to me, all alone here. When Terry was 5 years old, they had a fair over here in Paris, and so we took all the kids over to this fair. And it was kind of a hot day, and Terry came to me and said, Mom, can I have some money to get me a drink? And I said, yes. Do you want me to go with you? And he said, oh, I can get it. And so I waited, and I thought, well, gee, that's about time that he should be coming back. So I was worried about him, and I just started to go around to find him, and they were having horse races, and when Terry went, they weren't having them, but when he come back, they started these horse races. And Leroy was up in the top of the bleachers, and he saw Terry coming, and he saw him just about go in front of this horse, and he yelled and jumped down from the top of the bleachers, but the horse hit Terry and knocked him down. And Leroy ran over and said, oh, Mom, this horse has hit Terry, and he's dead. So we all started crying and ran over there, and this man had picked him up and brought him over and put him in his car. So we all got in his car, and I held him as we was going over the hospital. And he never moved, and oh, we were all so scared, afraid that he was dead. And just before we got to the hospital, he opened his eyes and looked around. So we took him in the hospital, and the doctor said that he had some broken ribs. And he stayed in there and got better, and he had to come home after he got better. We were so thankful that he was all right. Bruce went on a mission to the western states, and I don't know whether the war was on when he went, but before he came back, we was in war, and he said to lots of the homes that he would knock at and talk to the people, would say, what are you doing here for? You ought to be in the army helping the rest of the young boys. But anyway, when he came home, he was home only for about 2 weeks, and they called him to the army, and he had to go to Fort Gordon in Georgia for his boot training, and he was an MP. And he said he wanted to go overseas quite bad, and he asked them to let him go overseas, and they said no. And so I know that my prayers was answered, because I prayed and prayed that he wouldn't have to go overseas. So then he met Mamie when he was in Georgia, and they got married. And then they came to Salt Lake, and he worked in Salt Lake for a while, hauling bottles of milk to customers all around in Salt Lake. And then they went back to Georgia again. And he was the bishop 3 different times in Georgia and in the High Council. And he was a good missionary, and he still is. And he still works in the church and does things that are right. And Terry also went on a mission. When he thought that he was going on a mission, he was up to Pocatello going to tech school up there. And he came home once, and I said, when you get your call, do you want me to open it and tell you where you're going and then call you and tell you? And he said, yes. So when the call came, then I opened it and called him, and I said, guess where you have to go? I said, your call come. Guess where you have to go on your mission? He said, I don't know. And when I told him New Zealand, he said, New Zealand? So, but he went on his mission, and they were both real good missionaries. And Terry worked in the church, too. He was a 70, and he still is a 70. And then he's worked in the Sunday school and the choir, different things, and they're still good boys, and they still work in the church now. And I'm so grateful for that. When Fern was a young girl, her and LaDonna Parker went down to Syracuse to work in the canning factory down there, and that's the first time she'd ever been away from home. And when she came home, she was so homesick. She said when we got through the Logan Canyon and saw that beautiful lake, she said, oh, that was the prettiest thing I ever saw, and she'd saw it a dozen times before. Then when she came home, Dad wasn't here. He was still hauling milk. And she stood outside and waited till he'd come. And we had a picket fence out in front and a picket gate then. And when she saw him coming down there a little way, she ran and jumped over that picket fence and jumped in the truck and just loved him so much. She was so happy to be home. On the 4th of October in 1960, our house burnt down. We had 2 men shingling the roof of it, and we went to town to get groceries and to get $400 out of the bank. That's what it was going to cost to have the house, to have it shingled. And so when we come back, I put the groceries away, and I thought, well, I'll just go out and see how much they've done. So I went out, and this one guy was smoking, and you know, it's against the law to smoke while you're shingling a house. And I think that he just flipped the butt in the valley on top of the roof, and it started. I can't prove it, but I think that's what happened. Anyway, I had just got in the house, and Norma Passy called me and said, oh, Della, I think your house is on fire. So I run out, and it was. And I called them in, and I said, the house is on fire. And they said, oh, it's not either. It's just the smoke coming out of the chimney. And I said, it's on fire. And we had a little attic door on the top of the roof, and they opened that, and oh, the flames just came out of that. Anyway, I run in and called both Montpelier and Paris fire departments, and they said we can't come out of the city. And we didn't have force enough water to do any good, so we just had to let it burn. And anyway, everybody came. Those men jumped down and come in and grabbed the rugs off the floor, I remember, and pulled the drapes down. And everybody came from Montpelier and Paris. And in just a little while, I had everything out. I never saw so many people. They just swarmed in there and threw things out as fast as they could. And so we saved quite a lot. We didn't save the beds because they were too big to get out the doors. And of course, we lost all that fruit. It was in October, and I had just got through canning a lot of fruit. I guess I had almost 300 bottles there. And so they all got burned, and we had a lot of personal things burned. But most of the big stuff was saved. Anyway, Dad run in and got that $400 when we found out the house was burning down. And so after it was all over with, he paid those men the $400, and I said, what'd you do that for? I said, they didn't get the house only half shingled, and I think they burned it down anyway. And he said, I promised it to them, and they took it. They took the $400. Anyway, Catherine Hymas was the president of the Relief Society then, and so on one day she called a special day and had a shower for us, and she told each one of the ladies to bring 1 or 2 bottles of fruit besides something else. And we got all the fruit back, and people just came and just gave us so many things, towels and dish towels and pans and all that kind of stuff. And we really got a lot of stuff back, and I was so grateful for that. People sure did help us. The house was so dry and it was so old that it burnt down in 45 minutes. And I remember that when it first started, I fainted. And when I come to, I was wrapped in a quilt out on the lawn. And when I woke up, and Danny was standing there, that's Leroy's little boy, and he was just a little guy, and he took hold of my hand and he said, Grandma, we'll build you another house. It was bad to see it burn down, but then we got this other beautiful home built, and sometimes I can see now that maybe it was supposed to happen. I don't know. It kind of looks like it. I forgot to tell you that when we got a contractor to build our new home, Marvin Hymas was the bishop then, and he had 2 men come up, 2 different men every day to help build the house. And they got it done a lot quicker, and it saved us a lot of money. So that really helped. We did have a little insurance on it, but it didn't cover the whole thing, but it sure helped some. I remember there was lots of friends come almost every day to talk to us about the house burning down and how sorry they were. And I remember Dad saying, well, there's nothing we can do. She always wanted a big window in the front anyway. When Dad was in the Army, he was in a company of 250 men, and he was the only one that didn't smoke and drink in that whole company. And he said one night, 2 men came up with bottles of whiskey, and he said, you're going to have some of this. And he said they tried to pour it down in my mouth, and I closed my mouth so tight they couldn't get it down, but it spilled all over me. And then one of them said, "Come on, leave him alone. If he don't want it any worse than that, we're not going to make him take it." When Terry went to Rick's college before he got married, he went with 2 or 3 girls up there, and then all of a sudden he met Ruth. And he went with her, and he thought, he just felt like she was supposed to be the one that he was going to marry. So he wrote home and he told us about it, and he said, "Will you pray about it with me?" So before I even got through praying, he asked her to marry him, and he was engaged. And she said, oh, he went to his classes and he couldn't keep his mind on his lessons. He lost his books, and he had a rough time after that. But then they were married soon after that, and they have a lovely family. When Fern started dating, she went with quite a few fellows, and one night, and then she met Andy. And she come home once and said that she had met this boy, and his name was Andy, and he was such a wonderful boy. So one night when she come from a date with Andy, we were in bed, and she came in there and talked to us, and she said, "Mom, I'm going to get married." And I said, "You're not going to get married. You're too young. And anyway, we don't even know him." And she said, "You was only 18 when you got married," so I couldn't say anything about that. But she finally brought Andy to meet us, and he was a really nice man, and they got married and have had such a nice life, and they raised a nice family. There was a big canal right above where I used to live, and that's where they baptized everybody. So when I was 8 years old, I was baptized in there, and I was scared in the first place, and so when they brought me up, I started to cry. And here come a kid over, and he said, cry, baby," and he was bigger than I was. I didn't think a big kid like that ought to make fun of a little 8-year-old kid like me that was scared in the first place. I didn't like him after that. When Beth and I were little kids, we were outside playing, and we noticed some of the cows was laying down in the corral. And so we walked over there, and we said, "Gee, let's get on one of these cows." So each of us got on a cow, and mine jumped right up, and I fell in a great big soft pile of manure. And then when she saw what happened to me, then she jumped off of her cow. So I jumped up, and I was just covered, and I jumped up and started bawling and chased her. I'd want to put some on her because she didn't get any on her. So she looked back and laughed at me, and that made me worse than ever. So I chased her, and finally I couldn't get her. So we never got on a cow after that. Before Jay and Leroy was married, it was in the winter time, and we had had a blizzard that day, and it was really cold, and Jay had such a cold he couldn't hardly talk, and they wanted to go to Logan, and I said, "You can't go to Logan today." All day they had advertised that the canyon was closed anyway. So they went anyway, and sure enough, when they got partway through the canyon, there was a big sign that said it was closed, and they got out and took the sign away and went on through anyway. When they got to Preston, then Leroy called me back, and he said, "Jay's in the hospital." And I said, "Well, I told him not to go in the first place." He said he can't even say a word. So he stayed in the hospital all night, and then they come home the next day, and he had to get better. They don't mind sometimes, do they? When Leroy was young, he worked down here at Earl Nice for a little while, and he went to Logan one day, and he just got him a new car, a hardtop car, and it was a nice-looking car. So when he was coming to the canyon, he was going too fast, trying to get back to get to work, and he ran into a tree, and he said it just mashed the top down. So he got in and laid on the seat and kicked the top up as good as he could so he could sit with the steering wheel and come on home, but he was late for work. When Terry was a scout, his scout troop went up here on the hill above the cemetery skiing one day. It was in the winter, and Terry broke his leg. And Darryl Polson was his leader at that time, and he broke one of his skis in half and put on his leg till we get him to the hospital. We took him over to the hospital, and the doctor said it, but he had to have this on his leg for quite a long time. So he just didn't know what to do. So almost every day I'd get in the car and take him around the loop, and I used to take him fishing in this river down by Montpelier. And he'd fish, and there were little carp in there was all, but he would fish, and then he'd throw them back in, and then he'd catch some more and throw them back in. But that gave him something to do. He just didn't know what to do while he was on his crutches, but he soon got better and around again. When I used to take him around the loop, I made bread one morning, and I said, "Now, by the time we get back, then this bread will be ready to raise, and then we'll come back and put it in the pans and bake it." So when we come back, I'd forgot to put the yeast in it. It hadn't raised one bit. So then we had to wait a little longer I had to make some more bread. Elva was the homecoming queen when she went to high school, and she was a beautiful queen, and we was very proud of her. When Elva was in high school, she had a high school sweetheart. Her and Jim Gay had gone together for a long time, and they had planned on getting married, but he wasn't LDS, and she wanted a temple marriage. So they talked about it, and he said, well, he wanted to join the Mormon church, but he said, I want to do it myself. I want to find out for myself if it's true. And so he studied and studied, and finally he did find out that it was true, and he was baptized. Soon after that, he was called in the army, and he went to the Philippines. He was gone there for quite a while, and Elva went down to Salt Lake to work in the archives. There were several girls stayed together in a house down there, and they all was working. So one morning, before he went, he had given her an engagement ring and wedding ring, and they were going to be married just as quick as he got back. So one morning, bright and early, the phone rang, and I answered it, and it was somebody said that Jim had been killed. And so we hurried and got ready and went to Salt Lake. We went to his folks first up in Fish Haven, and they were feeling real, real bad. And we were so upset, too. I was crying. And Donovan Howell was up there, and he said, I'll drive you down to Salt Lake. He said, I don't think you're able to go down there yourself. And we said, oh, we'll be all right. So we drove on down, and Elva and the girls lived in a place just close to Liberty Park. And so we drove up to Liberty Park, and she wasn't there. And there was a little boy playing outside on the lawn, and we asked him if he knew where the girls were, and he said, yes, they're in Liberty Park. So when we went out to get in our car, he wouldn't go. It was just a little ways from Liberty Park, so we walked up there. And they were playing tennis. Her and Judy Park was playing tennis at Liberty Park. And they had just come out and was sitting down on the lawn to rest as we walked up, and she jumped up and said, Dad and Mom, what are you down here for? And we said, oh, we just come down to see you. And she said, I knew it. She didn't say anything, but she said, I knew at the time that something was wrong. But she said, I thought it was Terry. And so finally, they stood up, and Dad went over and put his arms around her, and then he told her. And oh, she just went hysterical, and so she hit at him and wanted to get away, and he held on to her real tight and wouldn't let her go until she kind of settled down. Then we took her home, and she really felt bad, and I felt so sorry. I thought, oh, if I could just go through this myself. She's so young to go through this. She waited there for quite a while, and then we took her home. And on the way home, she didn't talk. She just like she's in a trance. Toward evening, she went in her bedroom, and I said, do you want me to sleep with you tonight? She said, no, I'll be all right. And I said, well, just leave your door open. Our bedroom door and her bedroom door is right across from each other. And so she left the door open, but all night long I could just hear her sobbing. Oh, she just sobbed all night long, and I just felt so bad. So in the morning, right early, I got up and went in her room, and she was on the bed, and Jim had given her a little dog pajama bag, and she was holding that and just crying. The tears were just running down her face. So she stayed here. She didn't go back to work for 2 or 3 weeks, and she stayed here, and she was trying to do the best that she could. So then finally she went back to work again, and it was for a long time that she even wanted to go out with the boy. Finally she went with some of the boys and the girls together in a crowd. Then finally she went with 1 or 2 of them. Oh, I'm ahead of my story. Wait a minute. So they didn't send Jim's body for a long time. And when they finally sent it, she was so nervous waiting for his body to arrive. And when they finally sent it, then she asked Leroy if he'd take her over early. So he took her over early, and she was there by him for quite a while before the funeral started. And then they went to Salt Lake again, and she did go with a boy or 2, but she didn't like any of them. She think she was just looking for somebody like Jim, and she couldn't find anyone just like Jim. So finally one day some of the girls that she was staying with wanted to go on a mission, and they were going on a mission. So she asked the bishop if she could go on a mission too, and he said no. He said, you're not supposed to go on a mission. He said, you're supposed to find a good fellow and get married in the temple and raise a family. And she couldn't hardly believe that she should do that. She still thought so much of Jim, and she didn't want to. She wanted to be sealed to him at first, and then she kind of decided not to do that. Then one day she was, the one that she married now had just come from a mission, and they lived in the same ward. And the bishop said to Darryl, you know, there's some nice girls from Idaho. He said, have you met these girls from Idaho? And he said, yes, I've met them all, and I don't like any of them. And he said, you haven't met one. And so he said, Elva Hymas, you haven't met her. And so she was leading the singing, and he opened the door and come in, and there she was leading the singing. And he said to himself, oh, that's the girl I'm going to marry. So they started going together, and the first time that she went with him, the first time they had a date, then she stood him up, and he said, he went back again for another date. He said that's the first time he ever done that. So then they went together for quite a while, and then they were married, and they have a nice family now, and she's happy. Jay and Leroy and Nadine and Dorothy went up to the lake to a dance. That was before they were married. And I guess Jay started talking to another guy's girl up there, and he didn't like it very good, so they got into a fight, and his shoulder was dislocated. So they jumped in the car and drove clear to Logan to the doctor. And Nadine said they went about 90 miles an hour around all those curves, and she said, oh, I wanted to let me out, and they wouldn't let me out. And she said, gosh, I'd never get in the car and go that way again. She said, I was scared to death. So they took him down there, and the doctor fixed his shoulder and then brought him home again. And Jay and Leroy went over to Montpelier one night, and he said this boy was bugging him and following him all night, and he said, so he got out of the car and asked him what he wanted. And then they started a fight, and they had a big fight, I guess. And so the next morning when I got breakfast ready, I knocked on his door and went in and opened his door, and there he was sitting on the bed, and oh, he had a black eye, and his nose looked like it was broke. And I started to bawl, and I said, oh, what's the matter with you? And he said, nothing. Bruce had happened to be here, and so he went in and talked to him, and then he told him that he had a fight with this guy. Jay used to get in lots of troubles then sometimes. When Grandpa Hymas was a young man, he went out to Bern to work in the cheese factory, and he met this girl out there. She worked in the same cheese factory. And so they got married. She was 17 and he was 19. And after they were married, they lived up here on the hill, and I think they made cheese most of their lives. She had 17 children, 3 pair of twins. After she died, he married Martha Derrickett. And in those days, a gang of boys used to get together and chivalry 'em. And they'd run from place to place and lock the doors and everything, and they'd try to get 'em. And so they said, well, we'll leave you alone if you'll give us a dance. And he said, well, I will. So some of them just grabbed him and put him under the pump and just soaked him. And so he went in and got changed into dry clothes. And he said, well, I'll give you a dance. So just after that little while, here come some more boys that didn't know that they had done this to him. And so they put him under the pump and just pumped and just soaked him again. And he said, no dance, this is it. Now just leave me alone. So after that, they didn't bother him anymore. One day in the winter, Jay and Leroy decided to go up in the canyon and stay all night. It was 12 below zero before they left, and I said, oh, you're so silly to go up there with it cold like this. And they said, well, we're going anyway. So they took one little blanket. They didn't take any food or anything. It was so cold up there. They said they found a little cabin with some wood and stuff in it, and they made a fire and kept them warm part of the night. But I noticed that they got home awful early that next morning. And then they said, well, we wasn't going to go, but somebody said dared us to go, and so that's why they went. And I just was worried all night long. I could just see them up there froze. But they got back all right. They had done some foolish things in their lives. When Elaine and Kenneth were married, they went to Fort Worth, Texas to live soon after they were married. And she'd write pretty often. One time she wrote a letter and said that she opened her sugar bowl to get some sugar out of it, and it was full of bugs. She said there were just bugs all over, in their flour and in their food. And I guess it was really bad with bugs there. And then Kelly's dad was working on a tractor, and it tipped over and killed him instantly. And his wife had just had a new baby, just 2 days old, and so she was in bed. I don't think she even went to the funeral. And so we went up to the funeral. When we first moved up here, we sure needed some money. He didn't have much work, and so some of the men from here was going up to Bury to pick up potatoes. And he said, we had one cow, and he said, do you think you can milk the cow for a little while? And I said, well, I'll try. So in the house, I practiced and practiced trying to milk the cow for a long time. And I was about ready to go to the hospital. So the first night he left, I went out to milk the cow, and she kicked me in the gutter. And that was the first and last time I milked the cow. I called Eldon, and he came and milked the rest of the time, till I even got back again. I told you how much Dell loved his cat. I forgot to tell you this. After Dell was killed, his cat just laid on Dell's bed and wouldn't move. And I went in to feed him, and he wouldn't even move. He just laid there for 2 days. He didn't get up at all. And after 2 days, he died right on Dell's bed. I guess he could just sense that Dell wouldn't come anymore, and it just grieved him so much that he just couldn't stand it. But he was dead within 2 days. When Bruce was a young man, he loved to dance. I guess he took after your dad more than any of the others. Your dad and I went up to Sharon to a dance one night, and pretty soon Bruce came and brought a girlfriend, and they were dancing, and they just danced all night long so hard I thought they was going to dance the floor down. Anyway, pretty quick, lots of the people stood by the side and watched them dance, and they were good dancers, and he loved to dance. One day Leroy and David came over. I think David must have been about 11 or 12 years old. And he went outside, and all of a sudden he came running in, and he said, Grandma, do you have a gun? And I said, well, no. What do you want a gun for? And he said, there's some rock chucks under this little house out here, and I'm going to kill them. And I said, you're not going to kill them. I said, they're my little friends. I've watched them play and grow all summer long. Don't you dare kill them. They were so cute. They would run out and look around, and then they'd run back in again. Sometimes one of them would just stand on their hind legs and look around. And I took some pictures of them. They were so cute. When Elva was 9 months old, she had pneumonia. And in those days, when they had pneumonia, they just died. They didn't have any cure for it. But they just happened to get penicillin out about that time. And I called the doctor, and he came and stayed all night long with her. And he said, it's a good thing we got penicillin, or she would never lived if we hadn't had that. She was so sick. When I'd lift her up, I'd have to carry her around on a pillow. But she got better real soon, and I was so glad that they had penicillin that she got better. Before Terry went on his mission, he was up in Pocatello, and he'd been up there for a while working, and so he wanted to come down and go deer hunting. And so we went up and got him and brought him down. And the next morning he went deer hunting real early, and I said to him, Terry, I wish you wouldn't go alone. And he said, I'll be all right. And I said, do you have any idea where you're going to go first? Because if anything happens, it's a good thing to know or have kind of an idea where you thought you'd go. And he said, well, I think I'll go up in Copenhagen first. So we waited all day long, and toward evening he didn't come home, and I started getting more worried. About 9 o'clock, it was dark at 9 o'clock, and I said, oh, I'm going to call the sheriff. something could have happened to him, and he's up there all alone. So I called the sheriff, and he said, we'll go right up. So he got 3 or 4 men to go with him and went right up. And they came down at about 2 hours, and he said, we found the car. It was up in Copenhagen, but he said that his lunch was still in there. And then that made me more worried than ever. And he said, I'll get a posse together, and just as quick as the daylight, we'll go up and hunt again. So in the meantime, Marvin Hymas called, and he said to Dad, there's 2 or 3 men of us that's going up to see if we can find Terry. Do you want to go? And he said, yes. So I was here all alone, and Vange called, and she said, do you want me to come down and stay with you? And I said, oh, I'll be all right. And then right after that, Venna called, and she said, do you want me to come stay with you? And I said, I'll be all right. And she said, I'm coming down. So she came down and stayed with me all night long. And in the morning, here came the posse real early. And I remember Reed Hymas's boy on a horse. They were all on horses and jeeps. And he rode up right up to the door, and I opened the door, and he said, I said, please find him. And he said, we'll find him. We'll comb every inch of these hills. We'll find him. So then they went. And in the meantime, Terry had gone clear up on the way up in the hills. It was called the White Rocks. And he'd got a deer. It was quite a big one. And he said he didn't know how to get it down, so he cut it in half. And then he'd bring half of it down and go back and get the other half. And that's how he brought his deer down. And he said by the time he got it down off of the hills into the level place, he was so tired that he just couldn't bring it onto the car. So he said he had 1 match left, and he made a fire and stayed there all night by the fire. And then in the morning, he started to walk down out of the hills. And I think he was in Pole Canyon, got there by Lawrence King's place, and Randy was going up to help, look for him, and he found him and brought him home. And so when he got home, I was crying, and he said, what's the matter? And I said, what's the matter? You didn't come home all night long. And he said, well, I was all right. And I said, you was all right, but how did we know you were all right? But I was very thankful for all the men that helped so much, and that he was safe and come home safe. And I forgot to tell you that Venna was so good. She stayed all night with me, and she tried to keep my mind occupied on other things. Every time I could see car lights come down the road, I'd run to the door, but it wasn't him. And in the morning, when the radio station got on the air, then she called the radio station and had this put on the air. And he announced it every 15 minutes. And then he said, Terry has been found. And Venna came over and put her arm around me and just cried. Big drops fell on the floor. And I was so thankful for her staying with me, too. I left some out, so I'll have to tell you. Randy took Terry back up when he found him up to the car, and they brought the deer down. And Terry had to leave the next day, so he put the deer in the granary, and there was dirt all in there because he had dragged him so far. And so I went out and hosed them all down, washed them all out right good, and took them over to the store and had them all cut up and packaged. Steve Budge, that's Elaine's and Kenneth's boy, he used to like to hitchhike quite a lot. And so he came down here looking for a job. And he did get a job in what was the old creamery. They were making different things like doors and kitchen things for the kitchen. So he got a job over there, and he stayed over in the motel over in Paris. And we would go over almost every day to see if he was all right. So we went over one day, and it was conference. It was on a Sunday, and it was conference. And so I went up to his room and knocked on the door, and I said, he was still in bed, and I said, Steve, aren't you going to go to conference? And he said, oh, I'm still in bed. I didn't know it was conference. And I said, well, we'll see you over there. So we went, and he did. He came to conference. And then another time we went over there and went up the street to turn around, and when we come back, Steve had come down to the outside. He said, Grandma, I made a cake. I want you to come up and have a taste of it. So I did. We went up and had some cake, and it was delicious. And he kept his room so nice and clean. One day we went over there, and he was ready to go someplace, and I said, where are you going? And he said, I'm hitchhiking to Pocatello. And I said, well, I bet you won't get a ride here in Paris. I said, let's take you over to Montpelier, and maybe you can get a ride sooner over there. So we took him over up by the highway, and he stood there at the corner, and we watched him. And pretty quick he did get a ride. He hitchhiked once clear to Augusta, Georgia to see Bruce and his family. And he stayed there for 2 or 3 days. And one day they were going to town, and they said, "Steve, do you want to go to town with us?" And he said, "No, I'll stay here." So when they come home, they found this note on the table, and it said, "Thanks for letting me stay here. I have to go now. I have a date with death, and not knowing what day it will be on, I want to soak up everything I can. Love, Steve." He left, and he got as far as Cheyenne, Wyoming, and some man picked him up. And I don't know how long he was in the car before the man shot him 3 times in the head, threw his body to the side of the road. And they found the body, but they couldn't find any identification. They took him to the morgue in Cheyenne, and I guess he was there for 2 or 3 days, and finally they decided they better bury him. So they buried him in Cheyenne. And then a couple of boys was going along the side of the road, and they found his wallet. It had his identification and his name and where he lived in it. So they took it to him, and then of course they dug his body up and sent it to Pocatello, and they had a funeral up there, and we went up to the funeral. And soon after that, I saw a piece in the paper about a man that he was in the penitentiary, and he was going out on parole the next day. And this lady was there too, and she said, "Don't let him go." She said, "I was with him when he killed Steve Budge." So they put him back in the penitentiary again, and I haven't heard anything since, so I don't know what become of it. Right after Terry and Ruth was married, they came down, and Terry used to pick up hitchhikers quite a lot, and I said to him, "Terry, I don't believe you ought to pick up these hitchhikers. You don't know what they'll do or who they are." So when the was going back to Rexburg, he did pick up a hitchhiker, and he said he sat in the front seat with him, and he said he acted kind of nervous. He said they shared their lunch with him, and when he got to Blackfoot, he got out. And so then they went on to Rexburg. The next morning in the paper, it had his picture. He was an escaped convict, and they were hunting him. So Terry went down to the sheriff and told him about it. He said that he was in Blackfoot when they left him. And so the sheriff had another picture of another fellow, and he compared them, and he said it wasn't him, but it was one that they were hunting. They were both up for murder, and I don't know if they got him or not. But I don't think Terry picked up hitchhikers after that.